For over a century, the story of Britain seemed settled. Romans came, Anglo-Saxons came, Vikings came, Normans came, layer after layer of invasion, each one reshaping the island's people. It was a tidy narrative. Textbooks repeated it, museums displayed it, school children memorized it. It was also wrong. Not slightly wrong. Fundamentally, structurally wrong, in ways that rewrite everything we thought we understood about who the British people actually are, where they came from, and what those famous invasions actually did to the population. Because when scientists extracted ancient DNA from thousands of burial sites scattered across Britain, from Orkney to Cornwall, from the Bronze Age to the medieval period, they found a pattern that nobody predicted. A pattern so unexpected, it forced researchers to tear up decades of assumptions and start again. The story of Britain's population isn't the story of replacement. It's something far stranger, far more complicated, and far more remarkable. To understand how revolutionary these findings are, you need to understand what scientists thought they already knew. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model was simple. Waves of migrants arrived, outcompeted or absorbed earlier populations, and remade Britain in their image. The Celts replaced the Bronze Age people. The Anglo-Saxons replaced the Romano-British. Each wave erased what came before. This model was built on archaeology and linguistics. Different pottery styles meant different people. A new language spreading across a region meant its original speakers had been replaced. The logic seemed airtight. Then came ancient DNA analysis, and the logic fell apart. The first major shock arrived when researchers began sequencing genomes from Bronze Age Britain. What they found was a population that had already undergone one of the most dramatic genetic transformations in European prehistory. Around 4,500 years ago, the people who built Stonehenge, Britain's original Neolithic farmers, who had arrived from the continent around 4000 BC, were almost entirely replaced. Within just a few centuries, a new population carrying ancestry from the Eurasian steppe had swept across Britain, contributing up to 90% of the ancestry of subsequent Bronze Age populations. 90%, nearly complete population replacement. The scale of this event is almost incomprehensible. A people who had shaped Britain for over 1,000 years, who built its megalithic monuments and established its first farming communities, effectively vanished from the genetic record. Their descendants were still there in tiny proportions, but the dominant ancestry came from somewhere else entirely, the Great Pontic Steppe north of the Black Sea, where pastoralist cultures had recently mastered horse riding and wheeled transport. But here's what makes this discovery truly astonishing. There's virtually no archaeological evidence of violent conquest, no burned settlements, no mass graves consistent with warfare, no obvious weapon trauma in the skeletal record from this period at a scale that would explain such a transformation. So what happened? How does a population almost completely replace another without leaving evidence of catastrophic violence? Researchers now believe the answer may lie in disease. The steppe migrants appear to have carried plague. Ancient DNA analysis has found Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that would later cause the Black Death, in steppe-associated skeletons from this period. The original farming populations of Britain, with no prior exposure, may have been devastated by epidemic disease that cleared the way for the incoming groups without requiring direct conquest. A catastrophe so complete it left no monument, no memory, no recorded name, only silence, and a transformed genetic landscape. Britain had been remade before a single word of recorded history was ever written down. Then came the next shock: the Iron Age Celts. For generations, historians assumed the distinctive Celtic culture that dominated Britain before the Roman conquest represented another major population movement from continental Europe. The art, the language, the religious practices, they all seemed to point to migration from Central Europe or the Atlantic coast. The DNA evidence tells a different story. Genetic analysis of Iron Age. British populations shows remarkable continuity with the Bronze Age populations that preceded them. The people who spoke early Celtic languages in Britain, who worshipped at sacred groves and deposited treasures in rivers and lakes, appear to have been largely descended from the same Bronze Age population that had itself replaced the Neolithic farmers. Celtic culture seems to have spread as an idea, as a package of practices and prestige, rather than as a migration of Celtic-speaking people. This has profound implications. It means the Celts of Britain weren't invaders who displaced an earlier people. They were the earlier people, transformed. Think about what that means for the traditional story. Centuries of archaeological interpretation, built on shifts in pottery styles, metalwork, and burial customs, had led scholars to confidently assume that cultural change meant population change. That when new artistic styles appeared, new people must have carried them across the sea. Ancient DNA demolished that assumption entirely. Culture can travel without the people who created it. Ideas cross borders that populations never do. An entire chapter of British prehistory had been fundamentally misread, not because the evidence was hidden, but because nobody had the tools to read it correctly until now. Then Rome arrived. For 4 centuries, Roman legions, administrators, merchants, and enslaved peoples from across the empire moved through Britain. Roman towns grew. Latin spread among the urban elite. An entirely new material culture transformed the landscape. Surely this left a genetic mark? It did, but a far smaller one than expected. Roman period burials in Britain show significant genetic diversity, with individuals carrying ancestry from Southern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. But analysis of the broader British population across the Roman period shows that Roman immigration, while real and demographically significant in towns, had relatively limited impact on the genetic makeup of the overall population. The island was cosmopolitan in its cities. It remained largely indigenous in its countryside. This pattern, dramatic cultural transformation sitting on top of substantial genetic continuity, would prove to be one of the defining themes running through the entire genetic history of Britain. Conquest reshapes what people build, what language they speak, what gods they worship. It does not always change who they fundamentally are at a biological level. And nowhere would that pattern generate more debate than in the centuries immediately following Rome's departure. And then came what historians had always called the most transformative moment of all, the Anglo-Saxon migrations. After Rome withdrew in the early 5th century, Germanic-speaking peoples from what is now northern Germany and Denmark began moving into Britain. Within 2 centuries, the language spoken across most of England had shifted from Brittonic, a Celtic tongue, to Old English, a Germanic language. This was traditionally interpreted as evidence of near-total population replacement. The Romano-British wiped out, or pushed to the margins, the Anglo-Saxons inheriting the land. Ancient DNA from this period has now produced one of the most hotly debated findings in British genetic history. Studies of early medieval cemeteries in eastern England, the areas most intensively settled by Anglo-Saxon migrants, show that by the 6th and 7th centuries, between 25% and 40% of ancestry in these regions was derived from continental Northern European sources consistent with Anglo-Saxon migration. In some communities, that figure climbs higher. But the figure isn't 100%, or even close. Across Britain as a whole, the genetic impact of the Anglo-Saxon migration averages somewhere between 25% and 40% depending on region, significant enough to reshape language and culture, but not enough to erase the pre-existing population. The majority genetic ancestry across England remain tied to the earlier Bronze Age and Iron Age populations. Language replacement, it turns out, doesn't require population replacement. A relatively small but politically and economically dominant migrant group can spread its language across a much larger existing population. The English-speaking majority of modern Britain are genetically the descendants of people who, only 15 centuries ago, spoke a completely different language. The Vikings added another layer. Genetic analysis confirms Norse ancestry is most concentrated in Orkney, Shetland, and parts of northern and eastern England, consistent with historical records of settlement. But again, the signal is one of mixing, not replacement. In the Northern Isles, Norse genetic ancestry can reach 25% or more, a genuine and lasting demographic contribution. But even here, a pre-existing population absorbed the newcomers rather than vanishing before them. And the Normans? Despite their enormous cultural and political impact, the transformation of the English language, the restructuring of the entire feudal system, their genetic contribution to the modern British population appears to have been surprisingly modest. Political conquest and genetic replacement are not the same thing. The Normans numbered in the tens of thousands, entering a country of perhaps 2 million. Their French became the language of the court and the law. Their castles reshaped every skyline. Their genes barely moved the needle. So what does the DNA actually reveal? When you look at the genetic ancestry of people living in Britain today, you're looking at a palimpsest, layers written over layers, each partially obscuring but never fully erasing what came before. The deepest layer, faint but detectable, connects back to Neolithic farmers who walked Britain over 6,000 years ago. Above it sits the overwhelming Bronze Age steppe ancestry that remade the island before history began. On top of that, contributions from Iron Age continuity, Roman period cosmopolitanism, Anglo-Saxon migration, Viking settlement, and Norman conquest, each adding without completely replacing. Britain wasn't built by a single people. It was assembled across millennia by successive waves of movement, each leaving its mark without fully erasing the last. Modern genetic studies have shattered the clean, linear narratives of textbooks and replaced them with something messier, more complex, and more honest. The British people aren't the descendants of any single group. They are the cumulative result of every group that ever crossed the North Sea, the Channel, or arrived from across the steppe, filtered through thousands of years of mixing, survival, and cultural transformation. When you look at a person in Britain today, you are looking at the end product of 6,000 years of arrivals, each generation adding something new without erasing what the previous one left behind. The next time you hear someone speak of British blood as ancient and pure, or fixed and unchanging, the DNA record has an answer. Britain has always been a place where peoples meet, mix, and become something new. That is not a modern phenomenon. That is the oldest story of this island. And now, for the first time in human history, we can actually read it, written in molecular code, locked inside every cell of every single person who calls Britain home.